Welcome to Press, a conversation series highlighting the intersection of communications and business. I'm your host, Chris Cook. Joining me today is Evan Smith, CEO and co-founder of Texas Tribune, a nonprofit news organization based in Austin, Texas. Evan, welcome.
Thank you, Chris. So good to be with you. Wish I could be with you up there in Lubbock.
One day soon. One day soon.
We'll get back.
We'll roll out the red carpet and welcome you back. Absolutely. So when I moved to Texas 20 years ago, a little over 20 years ago, I came from states that had maybe 1 to 2 major media outlets. And Louisiana, Kentucky, Missouri, but not anything like Texas. Texas is just, to me, this rich media landscape. And news outlets with Austin and DC bureaus, coverage of politics, and it extended nationwide. It seemed a lot of the coverage you could get extended nationwide. In 2009, how did a brand new nonprofit news organization insert itself into that landscape?
Well, you're correct to say that we built from an empty lot. And I do think that there's some secret in that. I think if we had made the decision to buy an existing media brand, a newspaper, and there were a number at that time that were either on the block or were talking about being sold by their major parent companies. And a number have changed hands, by the way, since then. Had we bought an existing media brand, it would have been like painting over bad wallpaper or trying to refurbish an old house that really didn't have good enough bones that made it worth it. I think I and others who were around at the beginning of the Tribune thought we've been in the media business long enough that we've seen what works and seen what doesn't. Let's do the things that we believe in our own experience have worked over time, and let's leave the things that don't work behind. It allowed us to take best practices from our own experiences and from those of others, and to honestly, to switch analogies from media to medicine here, diagnose the ailment and then prescribe a cure. And for us, the cure was to, first of all, drop all the unnecessary legacy costs, the millstones around the necks of the business. The idea of printing and paper and postage, if you're in a print publication business. And of course, I was the editor-in-chief of Texas Monthly for many years. And so I know something about running a print publication, and especially one that has very heavy paper and glossy photography. The expenses associated with publishing a glossy magazine are even greater in some respects than you would imagine. But if you get rid of the cost of printing paper and postage and you focus your attention entirely on doing great journalism, paying people, buying technology to enable them to do their best work, to us, that was maybe the biggest best practice of all that we could put into place. And again, it was made possible by the fact that we were creating something from scratch. We saw, Chris, I've been in Texas actually now 30 years. And when I arrived here in 1991, 2 things were the case that are not the case today, and were not the case in 2009. They were impetuses for starting the Tribune. The first was that the number of newspapers in Texas from 91 to 09 had dropped significantly. There was still a Dallas Times-Herald in 91. There was still a San Antonio Light in 91. There was still a Houston Post in 91. There was still an afternoon newspaper in El Paso to go along with the morning paper. Could you imagine such a thing? That seems so quaint. And the number of reporters at the news organizations that were in business in 91 to 09 also dropped significantly. I think we estimated that there were a third of the number of reporters at the Capitol in 09 that there had been in 91. So the Tribune was started really as a solution to a problem. And the problem was that there was just not nearly enough coverage of this stuff, which we defined as public policy, politics, and state government. And look, it was a big risk. Ross Ramsey, my co-founder, the executive editor of the Tribune and the dean of the press corps, whether officially or not, everybody regards Ross as the great sage and the great veteran of the press corps. We likened ourselves at the time to Thelma and Louise clasping hands before we drove off the cliff. We didn't know whether there was something underneath us to catch us. It might not have worked. No one's more surprised to be standing here more than 11 years later with you to say, saying that this is a success and that this has been a success. And that not only has it been a success, but that it's spawned imitators with our help all over the country.
Well, so speaking of that success, you're just over 10 years, 11 years old.
Right. In year 12. I mean, I talk about us as 12 years old, but really we're in the 12th year.
We're in the 12th year. And it's been very successful. I think that there's no doubt it's been successful.
Well, we've raised, I'll tell you, Chris, we've raised more than $90 million to pay for serious journalism in Texas, which again,
that's
couldn't have imagined back in the day that there was that much money that people were willing to part with for this purpose.
Well, I would say that even in your first 5 years, not the 12 years, in your first 5 years, you were already making an impact on the landscape in Texas, and not just the journalism landscape, but the coverage of politics and public policy and education and these things that are so important to our daily lives that we pay attention to. What was the formula when you started, and what has distinguished the Tribune from its peers, from that traditional media the landscape you walked into?
So part of building from an empty lot means that you're making everything up. There's not really a playbook there. I mean, you're definitely, again, as I said, appropriating best practices, and you've had experiences in your life that you say, okay, this is something that I think we ought to take from that time that I worked at that place and make that a staple of what we do here. But honestly, you're making it up as you go. There's an aspect of it that where that's the case. Whether it's the inmates running the asylum, or if you have a little gray hair, it's Andy Hardy, Mickey Rooney back in the garage behind the house putting on a show. I mean, it's one of those things, but it's basically something where you're making it up as you go. And one of the things that Ross and I did in the spirit of making it up as we went is we said, what should be, this is before the beginning, when we were doing hiring, what should be the beats that we're going to cover at this place? And so we looked at each other and said, well, what are the largest lines in the state budget? The ones that get the most money. Maybe you can equate that correctly with the things that are most important in the state, because budgets are always moral documents. They tell you about your priorities, right? That's the cliche. So we said, okay, public education, healthcare, higher education, transportation, immigration, the environment, criminal justice, and energy. Those became our beats, right? Energy and environment together, and then transportation. So it was 8 beats initially: public ed, higher ed, immigration, healthcare, transportation, energy and environment, criminal justice. I mean, so you can go through the list. And so we said, we're going to hire people to cover those things. Well, that was the decision we made kind of in a snap way, and brought people in. And that was our approach. That was our philosophy. Now, one of the things that's happened you didn't exactly ask this question, but one of the things that's happened over the now 11 plus years is that we've seen what was right about those assumptions on the coverage areas and what was wrong about those assumptions. I think those fundamental beats were the right beats at the time, but over the years, we've realized that those beats are more intersectional. If you're covering public education, you also have to have some knowledge of immigration in the world that we're living in, Texas especially. You find that we know that more than 50% of the enrollment in Texas public schools across the state, 5.3 million enrolled students, is Hispanic. You have a lot of kids who are English as a second language, or limited English proficiency. Higher ed, we've had a discussion over the years that we've been in business, certainly about the opportunity for kids who are not documented citizens of the state to pay in-state tuition rates. Higher ed and immigration have a conjoining. I mean, look right now at the impact of the pandemic on higher ed, places like Texas Tech or other universities, and the impact of a pandemic on public ed. So if you have a public or higher ed reporter, they have to have some knowledge, at least rudimentary, of healthcare. My point is, it's impossible to stay as a beat reporter in your lane. Yeah. You're in every lane. And so we've had to rethink those beats. And, I think of those as vertical beats, but we've also figured out that there are horizontal beats. Race as a narrative through line these days, especially, is a fantastic journalistic narrative element that cuts across those vertical beats: public education, healthcare, criminal justice, right? So I think that's definitely one of the many ways that we approached it. And also one of the things about being a news organization these days is you have to be adaptable as you discover new things.
What was your philosophy with Texas Monthly during that time? Did you develop it over time? And then is it a similar philosophy you applied at Texas Tribune, or did you blow it up and start over?
It's a really great question, because those two institutions, while they both have Texas in the name and they're both statewide media, they're the only real statewide media organizations. I suppose the public radio program Texas Standard is a little bit similar to those two in the sense of being statewide, but really as these two institutions, the Tribune and Texas Monthly, go, there's there's that aspect to them that are similar, but there's also a lot about them that are different. So let me kind of do the Texas Monthly half first, and then let me try to do the roll forward second. Texas Monthly was founded in 1973. I got there in 1991, so 18 years after its founding, almost 19 years. I was there for about 18 years. So I basically ended up staying as long as it had existed before I had gotten there. And there had only been 2 editors of the magazine before me. I didn't become the actual editor of the magazine until 2000, right? So Bill Broyles, who was the first editor of Texas Monthly from 73 to 81. Second editor was Greg Curtis. Bill and Greg had been roommates at Rice University. Bill was employee number 1. Greg was employee number 2. There's a famous story about them carrying furniture up the stairs at the old offices at 15th and Guadalupe in Austin back in the first days of Texas Monthly being in business. Greg worked for Bill as his number 2. I worked for Greg as his number 2, and then I became the number 1. And Bill's magazine was different from Greg's, and Greg's magazine was different from mine, because every magazine is a reflection of the editor's tastes, interests, and experience. And that's how it ought to be, because even though the brand is the same, the perspective of the person at the top changes. I'm interested in politics and have always been interested in politics from the time I was a kid. Greg, not so much. Bill, probably somewhere between the two of us, but closer to Greg than me. So my Texas Monthly was necessarily going to be much more focused on politics, current issues, and all that. Still a home for the very best narrative nonfiction in the state and in the country. Still a writer's magazine. But what we wrote about would be a little different and would be impacted in some way by my own perspective. So my approach to Texas Monthly was, what is the story of Texas now, and what is the story of Texas going to be going forward? What is the vision that we have for the state, not in the way that a politician might have a vision where you build an agenda and then you pass legislation to get from point A to point B, but what is our theory of the case for Texas, and where is Texas going, and what are the stories of the current Texas and of the new Texas that we need to be telling? So that was in a nutshell how I approached the job of being editor of Texas Monthly. And I believed, as every editor of Texas Monthly has and rightly should, that the writers really drive the creative enterprise. We would say to writers at the beginning of every month, submit ideas, things that you want to write about, and let's talk about the things that might be right for the magazine. Bottom up rather than top down, right? It was a conversation that we would have with the writers that the writers would drive. Now, the Tribune is a different deal. I mean, I do believe that the people who write the stories and who edit the stories are critical to the function of this place. But, you know, the news is not the same as writing a feature, covering the news or reporting on the news. It's much more immediate, and it's much more bang, bang. And I think, you know, while the general idea of having a theory of the case about Texas and understanding where the state is and where the state is going is critical to the success of this place, it's not, I don't think that the editor necessarily can play or should play the role at a news organization that the editor plays at a magazine. Magazines are also journals of opinion inherently, which is not to say that we editorialize, but the point of view of magazine stories is much more visible and much more pointed often. And we, as a nonpartisan news organization, believe that our job is not to be on the field of play. We don't wear the uniform of any team but Texas. And I'm very committed to the idea that, as we say, I play tennis. That's the one thing I do other than work. Down the middle solves the riddle. You got to stay down the middle with the stuff that you do. Real balance, not false equivalency, fair, thorough, and accurate. Pull no punches, but hit both cheeks. You can say it any way you want. And I think there are differences. Look, I think many of the characters are the same, but the players are the same, but the rules of the game have evolved over time. And I think news is different from magazines, but I think the through line is Texas always.
What is your assessment of the first decade, a little more than a decade?
Of the Tribune?
Of the Tribune, yes.
I think we've done a really good job. I'm kind of a self-hater by nature, and so I'm always looking for things to dislike or to be improved upon. And I have definite points of view about things that we probably could have done better. Look, no one's perfect. Nothing is perfect. And if the answer to that question, if you ask anybody that question, how was your first decade at X? And they say, oh, it was absolutely perfect, I would not do anything differently, they're lying or they're deluded. I think you always have to, look, let me say it this way. I came into this business out of graduate school, not as a writer, but as an editor, as somebody whose orientation was toward taking a look at the work that was in process and assessing it in short order and trying to figure out how it could be made better. My disposition as a journalist is to help make things better and to believe that things can be made better. That's not to say that there's not a point at which you stop and say good enough is good enough, but I do think it's critical that you accept as a proposition going in that revision and improvement are part of the deal. So I come to the table every day thinking, what did we do yesterday that we could have done better? So that when we make decisions about today and tomorrow, they're informed by what we learned from yesterday. So, I mean, that's why this thing it's an ongoing process with the Tribune. I say often we're succeeding, we haven't succeeded. I never want to pronounce the game over because I always think there's time to do better, right?
Journalists rely often on public and media relations professionals.
Yeah.
Usually the contacts with organizations, people that they can reach out to get to the people they need. How important are those relationships to the Tribune? And based on your many encounters, people in these roles, what advice regarding these relationships and establishing these connections would you give to journalism students and public and media relations students as they embark on their careers?
So I think public relations professionals, media professionals, comms people are critical. I think they play an important role. They're conduits of information, they're connectors. But I also don't think they are the be all and end all in this respect. You know, I have over 30 plus years in journalism developed relationships with the so-called principals. An elected official rather than with the comms person. I have a relationship with the senator or the congressman. I might have a relationship with the CEO, or I might have a relationship with, whomever. And that relationship is really the glue for me. I don't feel like because of there being a communications person in a senatorial office or a congressional office that I am obligated to forget that I have an existing relationship with the principal and just always go that way. I think you respect chain of command, but I also think, come on. So I try to always respect people in that PR role, communications role, but it's a both and, not an either or.
Right.
And I think the most successful of the PR and communications people are the ones who themselves attempt to build personal relationships with journalists, not to try to get them to not write something that they wish they wouldn't write or to get them to write something that they don't want to write, but because those relationships, they grease the wheels. They make it possible. I mean, you kind of understand where each other is coming from. Look, everything in the world is transactional in the sense that you in your role and I in my role each want something, need something. And that's the magic of work and life, is figuring out how we can both come through an encounter and experience a conversation and come out the other side feeling that we both got something that we wanted or needed. And so I'm always conscious of respecting, working with, in a genuine way, the people in communications roles. And so my strongest advice to up and comers and to people in the business would be that a personal relationship is the mother's milk. And if you're Chris Cook at Texas Tech, I hope this is true. It's in your interest to know the higher ed reporter at the Texas Tribune.
Absolutely.
And so you build a relationship with that person, not only at a moment when you need her, but when you don't. And you think about how you can help that person as she does her job. And you think about how you can get Texas Tech's good work in front of her as often as possible, knowing that you're not going to get every single story you want written. The comms person who sends a press release to a journalist and then complains when that journalist doesn't reprint the press release is not going to be in that job very long. It's about telling stories. We have a job to do. You have a job to do. Let's figure out how we can each do our job, each get something out of it, and respect one another's place on either side of the line.
Evan, with that, I'm going to thank you for your time, and I appreciate you taking the time to visit.
See you on the other side of all this.
Yes, sir. We will.
All right. Take care.